I just beat the massive Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Let's find out if it delivers in this review. Huge thanks to Square-Enix for providing a copy of the game to me. On the surface, Rebirth's combat gameplay feels close enough to Remake in that the ATB real-time command system is back, with full control of up to 3 party members, but the moment-to-moment gameplay feels vastly different and I'd say improved. For starters, you're not limited to ground combat anymore, as you can leap into the air and unleash combos for extended periods of time without ever touching the ground. There's also a brand new team mechanic called Synergy, where 2 party members can perform actions and abilities together. Not only are there standard quick actions, but also a gauge-based special action that is almost like a team limit break, leading to some pretty epic matchup scenes while giving both party members special buffs or effects. These synergy abilities are unlocked along with some general stat boost upgrades on a progression web called Folios, accessible from most towns and rest areas in the game. Enemy encounters and boss fights still retain a lot of the feeling that they had from Remake, which isn't a bad thing at all given the sense of scale and excitement that a lot of these fights have, but I did find them feeling overall more fast-paced in general. My main criticism is that I found a lot of the combat encounters, especially some of the essential story encounters, had enemies that really focused on stun abilities, leading to what I'd call stun spam. There's a few different things in this game that I'd consider stun, like the stone status effect, which can be cured with an item, but I'm talking about a specific kind of stun that basically dazes the party member and makes them unable to move or perform any kind of actions for a set period of time. I noticed that the enemy AI focuses mostly on whichever party member the player's controlling, and it's pretty obvious that this is the case, which means that most of the time, the character that you're controlling will be the character who gets stunned. Fortunately, this wasn't the case with every encounter, and maybe there was some kind of counter strategy that I just didn't know how to use to avoid it, so it could all be down to my personal taste and skill, or lack thereof in this case. On the other hand, most of the fights in this game are incredibly fun and challenging without being quite frustrating. The highlights being the boss fights, but sometimes you'll just get that random standard fight that's just epic for no other reason than it just can be, especially when this game doesn't shy away from sometimes giving you huge crowds of enemies that I don't even think would have been possible on the PS4. But back to combat in general, almost everything has been adjusted or changed in some way, with a general overhaul of progression and leveling, my favorite being the weapon progression. Every character has a variety of weapons, and each weapon has a special combat ability that can be mastered, unlocking the ability permanently for use even if you switch to another weapon. The conditions to master each weapon vary, but as someone who typically just uses whichever weapon has the highest attack stat, this system encouraged me to break out of my comfort zone a bit to try some other weapons even if they didn't necessarily have the optimal attack power. And speaking of getting out of my comfort zone, Rebirth does something I find genius in that it forces you to play with different characters and party compositions. While there are a handful of new playable characters like Yuffie and Red 13, I found myself sticking with the primary party of characters that I was already comfortable with, not really wanting to bother with different and unfamiliar characters. However, there are plenty of portions of this game where the characters are separated and you're forced to control someone who isn't Cloud with a party that you may not be used to using. This seemed frustrating to me at first, but it really forced me to understand the game's mechanics on another level and actually learn how to use these characters when I otherwise wouldn't have. The game isn't afraid to push you out of that comfort zone, and on the other side of it, I think it's all the better for it, and it made my experience feel more fresh at all times, especially during times when there was maybe a lull in the action or the story wanted to build suspense. And piggybacking off of that, I personally had some issues with the pacing in Remake due to having to retread certain areas or have my progression stopped entirely, and I don't think I'm alone in that. In fact, it almost feels like Square-Enix themselves were aware of the issues and tried to address them head on in a really interesting way. There's a few times in this game where you'll explore an area or dungeon as one part of the total party, and then the game will switch perspectives entirely and make you retread those areas as a different party composition, hence the forced change in playable characters. The first time this happened, I immediately rolled my eyes and thought I was about to be treated to a whole bunch of padding and filler, but to my pleasant surprise, the retread was not what it seemed, instead opting to completely change the way you explore those same areas. There's a few different mechanics that it exploits that sometimes leads to you seeing completely different areas of the same dungeon. This is done a handful of times, and I don't want to spoil the surprise, but almost every time I thought there was going to be meandering or padding, my expectations were turned upside down, and I ended up liking this game more and more because of that almost self-awareness from the developers. Of course, toward the end of the game, there are a couple of segments that admittedly don't handle this as well, and to me felt almost like meaningless padding, but they still felt minuscule overall compared to the last game. And I've barely buried the lead a bit here, but the absolute biggest change from Remake to Rebirth is the total departure from a linear experience to a far more open-ended one. Remake was a linear adventure with arguably limited options for real exploration, but Rebirth opts for a massive and hybrid semi-open world with plenty of diverse and interesting locales to explore. With an open world, of course, there's the risk of large swathes of nothing meaningful to find and just emptiness, but in my experience, there's always something to find or fight or discover with all kinds of side quests, collectibles, and milestones like the adorable chocobo stops that you can repair, or Chadley's monster intel missions. Yeah, there's the Ubisoft-style tower here and there, but they don't actually feel like the main objective like your Breath of the Wild-style towers, and instead mostly exist as fast travel checkpoints along your path. There was never a time that I found myself feeling bored or tired of this open world, which is more than I can say for a lot of other open world games. It would take a very long time to get into all of the optional and side content that you can explore in this game, as this game is pleasingly full of content. There's quests inside every town, the open world exploration discoveries, and a weirdly huge variety of minigames, like an overwhelming number of minigames, with the highlight for me being Queen's Blood. This is a card game that I found myself unable to tear away from, since you find opponents in pretty much every major hub area. It's an incredibly simple to learn but difficult to master strategy game, and unlocking cards and messing with deck compositions is always a thrill. Let's talk about visuals now. This game has a 30 FPS graphics mode that pushes for a higher resolution at the cost of frame rate, and a performance mode that seems to target 60 FPS but is rendered in 1080p. I personally played this game entirely in performance mode because I'm primarily playing on a 1080p display. I've seen some complaints that the game looks fuzzy or muddled, but I personally didn't have that experience at all. Of course, I'm not playing on a giant 75-inch display, so this footage could look awful to you if you're on one of those, but to me, it looks perfectly clear. But moving beyond that, this game in general is just incredibly beautiful. Remake already looked good, but Rebirth pushes it to a whole new level, which is a feat given that it's a totally open world. Characters look completely refreshed and more realistic, environments are detailed and varied, with lush forested areas or arid rocky environments looking equally beautiful, and the general scale and scope of this world is just breathtaking at times. You have the added ability to sprint in this game, but sometimes I just found myself walking at normal speed just to take in the environments. Sometimes I even stopped to take some shots in the photo mode. This game is truly a marvel to look at, and the only thing that ever really bothered me was a little bit of pop-in that would sometimes happen in the overworld, and this weird visual bug that would sometimes happen during conversations, but it only happened to me about twice. Finally, let's talk about the story. I'm going out of my way not to spoil any major plot details, so I have to be a little bit vague here, but this overall story delivered in just about every way I could hope. I found myself hooked from beginning to end, and I'm sad that it's over. Fortunately, though, the story goes beyond just the main scenario because, again, there's so much side content, and a lot of it is full of really wonderful little character moments and entertaining writing that not only fleshes out the characters themselves, but the overall world of Final Fantasy VII. If you're here just for an entertaining story, I promise you won't be disappointed with the main story or any of the side content. There's so much more that I could say about this game and tangents that I could go on, from the beautiful music with clean battle themes that smoothly transition from the world themes to the little chocobo wrangling stealth puzzles, but I think my main takeaway here is this. Rebirth is an evolution of Remake, but they also somehow feel worlds apart. Rebirth is just a whole different beast, almost like Remake was just a test bed, which feels insane to say, because Remake felt huge when it came out. It's just that Rebirth widens the scope so much, it makes Remake pale in comparison, which isn't to say that Remake isn't good or worth playing, it just should give you an idea of how much further they took everything in Rebirth. If you like RPGs or adventure games, this is a must-play title in my opinion, and I'd even extend that to people that aren't the biggest Final Fantasy fans. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is Square-Enix firing on all cylinders, and I honestly have no idea how they could outdo this in a part 3, but I'm super excited to find out. Seriously, play this game. I couldn't tear myself away from it, and there's still so much more left for me to do even after seeing the end credits. You won't be disappointed by the length. My final playtime was just under 60 hours, and that's just beating the main scenario and only casually touching some of the side content. I can see 100% runs easily taking upwards of 200 hours or more. One day I plan on doing a full Neo-Sci deep dive that goes into a lot more detail and touches on everything that I couldn't for the sake of time, so keep an eye out for that eventually. Real quick though, I want to thank my patrons for being absolute legends, including Nats Ash and Mego and Gaga in the Played Every Game tier, along with these wonderful people that you see on your screen here. And thank you so much for watching. You should play this game. As always, have a fantastic day. Now, hang on. Before we go, one more thing. So the main portion of the review is is done, but I really quickly want to talk about something that I dealt with later on in the game. Huge spoiler warning for Chapter 12. This involves a very specific portion of Chapter 12, so if you haven't gotten to that part yet, thank you for watching, but I really highly suggest you click away. In Chapter 12, there's kind of this boss rush. You fight a series of fights, including a somewhat frustrating Tonberry fight, but that's all manageable with some preparation. But what's going on with this Rufus boss fight? Like, unless I missed something super obvious, this was harder than the final boss for me. Fighting Rufus here feels like you're almost playing a completely different video game with the strategies that you have to employ to beat him. Now, I normally wouldn't bring special attention to a specific boss fight, but this boss fight stood out to me in such a way that it almost dragged down my experience with this game. That's why I'm thinking that there has to be something I missed, right? There has to be something that I didn't do right that made this boss so difficult. Anyways, I just wanted to mention that because it's so deep into the game that no one's really talking about it yet, but I legitimately want to know what I should have done to actually finish that fight properly. If you do bring anything up in the comments, be vague about it so you don't spoil anything for anybody, but I would love to hear other people's experience with the fight, just in a non-spoilery way.